So our first presenter this morning is Arvin Gouw, who is currently pursuing theology and science at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Divinity. Arvin is also a co-founder of a biotech company called Bacchus Therapeutics. And his upcoming book with Ted Peters, who presented yesterday, is CRISPR Revolution in Science, Religion, and Ethics. Take it away, Arvin. Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so this question, can AI help to make us more virtuous? I end up writing several versions of this paper. So this is a variant of the one I believe sent to Braden. So I want to raise questions about the question, which is maybe what is AI itself using a classical framework, symbolic versus embodied, knowledge and purpose, and considering AI as a virtuous friend. So kind of seeping into the papers on day 3. And then what is intelligence, and then finally what is virtue. So we just think of AI, symbolic AI and embodied AI. I think symbolic AI imbued by knowledge should have some purpose, and there'll be some safety concerns and prioritization concerns. And then embodied AI can raise the questions of passions and the notion of self with qualia that Ted also brought up yesterday. So in terms of symbolic AI, many of you know this. The symbolic AI notion is predicated that human thought could be represented by a set of basic facts, which could then be combined, synthesized according to set rules into more complex ideas. The second idea, AI through embodiment can interact with the environment and can allow learning. And of course, these two are now being blurred. You can have disembodied AI that interact with the environment. Now, I want to begin with seeping into question from the day 3, because I think if we think of how can an AI make us more virtuous, in the Aristotelian sense, and I'm wearing my Thomistic hat, we can cultivate morality with others, cultivate virtue with others, either by seeing the other person as a moral example, as a role model, that's more morally superior than us, or by having a friend that's someone more equal to us. Right? So this brings up the question then, to what extent can AI be virtuous? When we ask the question, can AI help us become more virtuous? So we look at this knowledge and purpose. I think we can see different kinds of AI. And in terms of knowledge, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You can have unlimited knowledge to limited. And in terms of purpose, you can have specific purposes of AIs, or you can have a general kind of purpose AI that can have a freedom to dictate what the ultimate end should be in any particular scenario. And we can categorize this with the AI gadgets. If you have purpose here, specific versus general, and knowledge, limited versus unlimited, you can have a 2x2 column where you have a limited knowledge AI combined with specific goals. This would be like my Echo right here that keeps trying to talk to me and sending me notifications. Or you can have a specific AI like the Deep Blue to win a chess game, but with unlimited knowledge in terms of the calculations of all the possible chess moves. I would consider myself as a human with general goals. We can set our own goals, but limited in terms of knowledge. And I think people are thinking, when they think of AGI, maybe unlimited knowledge and also be able to be independent, right? It's kind of superhumanism. I think the fear of this is a famous example by Nick Bostrom. When you have a specific goal but unlimited knowledge, you can imagine a paperclip maximizer that'll use up all the iron, deplete all the irons in the world to just produce paperclips. Right? In the sense, the moral agent of the designer becomes culpable in this, like the engineer fathers that Brian mentioned yesterday. So I think in terms of, between having specific purpose or general purpose, identifying your own ends, I think this raises the issue of prioritization. How can an AI know what should be the bigger picture here? Because even us humans, we struggle and we disagree. Right? So how would that help us in that sense? When it comes to limited to unlimited amount of knowledge, I think there's a safety concern. How much the AI can know, even about us, more than we know ourselves. Right? So there's a safety privacy concern over here. Now, that's the symbolic AI discussion. Now I want to go somewhat deeper, to lower, if we're using the hierarchies, into the passions, into being embodied. Can an embodied AI be our virtuous friend? Review this question again. Virtues in the Thomistic sense involves not only the intellect, but the passions, right? More specifically, when the question is brought up, can AI help us become more virtuous? I think a lot of the discussion revolves around virtues being moral virtues. And in a Thomistic sense, that means moral virtues are the virtues that perfect the passions of the soul, the emotions. So this is within the realm of emotions, a lot of it, right? But this requires the existence of a soul, right? So you have passions, could be passions of the body. This is bodily sensations, being able to detect pain, and things like this. I think an embodied AI can have sensors to detect pain, but to have a reflection of emotions of the soul would necessitate the existence of the soul. Then affections, you can have intellectual affections which are independent of the body. But this is even more distant than that. So I think when we talk about moral virtues, they revolve mainly around in this area. And I think in this sense, because they're if they're disembodied, it's difficult. Even if they're embodied, because they don't have emotion the way we do, they cannot become moral agents in a Thomistic sense. Right? We can agree or disagree with the model, but I think at least the model helps delineate, distinguishes what we can say when. Now, the second part, what is intelligence? Can AI improve our intellect? Right? So I think we have kind of, at least in the Thomistic framework, we have said, no, an AI cannot be a moral agent because moral requires passions and so forth and so on. And so then we're looking at the I part of the AI, the intellect. Can their intellect improve our intellect and make us virtuous? Right? So can AI help with the cultivation of our intellectual virtues? Right? So this is important to realize because many of the discussions here assumes moral virtues, but not intellectual virtues. And there are three intellectual virtues in this framework, which is understanding or intellectus, science, scientia, and wisdom, sapientia. Intellectus has to do with the grasping of first principles. Scientia has to do with the derivation of the truths using deductive methods, constructing arguments, right, dialectics. And then sapientia has to do with the grasp of the higher causes. And then we can review the questions again. Now, at the level of intellect, can AI improve our intellect, right? And therefore improve our intellectual virtues, make us more intellectually virtuous? I think when it comes to intellectus, in terms of understanding first concepts, I think it can help. It can provide more information, more data. I think with drawing heuristic connections, it could also help if the AI can explain their own reasoning, their own big box, their own black box. Right? And then sapientia, I think this is more challenging because this pertains to the higher causes. And this is the same concern that I have with the general goal-minded AI. Now, the question then becomes, can AI help us become more virtuous? I think the question itself has a progression, right? And it has to do with us. Right? So when we have ChatGPT and ask AI to do connections and some logic deductions based on their abilities, that's them doing it, not us. We get the end product, right? But virtue involves a habit. It's not a progress, and virtue is not the accumulation of more information. So when we talk even about scientific progress, scientia even, it's not about the additional of new laws or new information, but it's actually to become better in scientia, which is drawing scientific conclusions from scientific methods, using scientific methods from the general premises, right? So science here, even as a mental habit, is gradually acquired through the practice of doing science. So Aquinas says science can increase in itself by addition. Thus, when anyone learns several conclusions of geometry, the same specific habit of science increases in that person. Right? So I think in that sense, we have to distinguish, because if we just think of the product, then we have the problem of us not being engaged in the process and leaving it to the AI. And these are Noreen's concerns yesterday. So I think this is where virtue ethics is important. So now I think in terms of the metaphysical structures of a person, we've been dealing a lot with reason over here, which is zoomed out over here. That reason in terms of speculative reason, wisdom, science, understanding. But there's also practical reason over here that we haven't talked about much. Okay? And I think let's go into the lower now, the more unconscious levels of what is virtue. So if we had discussed, as I said before, in terms of wisdom, science, and understanding the intellectual virtues, there's this overlap in the Thomistic framework that I think is helpful. It has come up several times in various papers that we need prudence. Prudence comes up because it sits within the realm of reason, but it's the kind of reason that's oriented kind of downward to the wills and the passions. So that's why we keep saying, oh, we need to be careful. We need prudence as a very important virtue. Right? There's an overlap here that I think is helpful in the structure. That's one of the moral virtues. But when we go further down with the other moral virtues, actually a lot of the moral virtues pertain to the will, justice, and then a lot more pertains to the passions, the fortitude, temperance, and so forth and so on. So when we say things like, you know, AI really gets under your skin, it tempers with your desires. It's true within the Thomistic framework. It tempers with our passions, not at the level of intellect anymore, but something lower. And moral virtues is actually the organizing or the lining up or the ordering of these lower passions, according to Aquinas. So I think there's some harmony here, at least, that we can see. So now the question becomes, what is the relationship between AI, now not with the intellectual virtues as before, but now with these kind of moral virtues, with our moral virtues, right? I do want to say that I don't think there's any problem with equating intelligence and intellect, at least in the Thomistic framework. Intelligence is defined as the act of the intellect. Okay, so let's settle that definition. And then the question then from that intellect, how does it relate to the will? Because moral virtues acts on the will in the sense of justice. And then what's the relationship between intellect and the passions and emotions, which is on the temperance and the fortitude. So to answer whether AI can make us more virtuous is to ask whether our AI-aided intellect, actually, or IA, right, can guide our will and passions better. Right? That's shifting the question. That's what we're really asking. How can our enhanced intellect regulate our will and passions better? With regards to the will, I think, yes, AI can help in the sense that any decision is an input of both the intellect and the will, in the sense that intellect liberates the will from previous misconceptions in moving forward. With regards to the passions, in some ways, no, because the passions actually act on the will and influence the will. But in some sense, yes, because the intellect also has its passions and inform the passions on what is good. So we go into the Thomistic passions, we can see that passions is about moving towards something that is good, an upward arrow, or moving away from something that is perceived as bad. And this depends on the intellect. So AI can help us to assess better of what end is good and what end is bad. If the AI is designed just so that we have increased time on the internet, on ChatGPT, then that is a bad end because it will misconceive, it'll distract our passions to go in that way, even though that is not necessarily the end that we would want for ourselves, right? So I think this framework does help. And this is where AI can help us become more virtuous, but it can also help us gain more biases. Last but not least, I do want to mention the question, can AI help us become more virtuous? There's also the theological virtues. I need to touch upon this because theological virtues, by definition, are from God and for God. Therefore, AI has nothing to do with it. Right? AI cannot go in this arena in the Thomistic classical framework. Now, what are the benefits of this ancient model of Thomistic passions? I think the key is not just focusing on one virtue or just on virtue ethics per se, but this virtue ethics sits on a larger metaphysics of a person, and this metaphysics of a person is one that is integrative by nature vertically. And so you have to have an alignment of the theological virtues with the intellectual virtues with the moral virtues, and I think this is what's important, right? So actually, in significant departure from Aristotle, Aquinas sought to integrate the intellectual virtues into a framework that includes the moral virtues below it, theological virtues above it, so to speak, and then the gifts of the Spirit. And you have overlap, for example, the gift of the Spirit of wisdom is also intellectual virtue, and you have overlap of like hope as a theological virtue, but also as a passion. So these overlaps help you transition from the lower to the higher and influence from the higher to the lower. And I think this interaction is helpful for us to think about virtues. Concluding remarks. So the answer to the question whether AI can make us more virtuous really varies largely on the definitions of the terms. I think that's what my paper initially stated. The definition of the terms do not only define the terms in question, but they also presuppose some underlying metaphysics of a person, or at least I would say it is necessary. Need some kind of a form to allow for the functions of the virtues to act. So addressing the question using some Thomistic frameworks, I think, help us to give nuanced responses based on the structure that we have adopted, at least for these purposes. The disadvantage is that this is an ancient structure, but if we ask about modern neuroscience, is there a structure? No, or at least there are too many and people cannot agree. I think as a theologians, we can bring something in and then let's have a disagreement based on the scientific data. How do we tinker? But at least we see some overlaps where it makes sense. We see some integration that I think is very helpful. And then if we need to modify it, this might be a good start to answer this very difficult question. With that, I'd like to thank you, Braden, for organizing this, and Bob and all the other panelists and attendees. Thank you. Yes, Catherine.
Hi. That was so fabulous. I would really like to go to coffee and just go over those slides one at a time, very, very slowly. You agree, Bob? Yeah. I have a question in the very beginning about purpose and how you're conceptualizing purpose. And I'm wondering, do you see, and this kind of echoes some of the papers that we saw yesterday, are you thinking that purpose originates in the developer or in the machine itself? Is that intentionality, or is that reason for having been created?
Right, I don't know. I feel like in terms of specific AIs, it is definitely given by the developer. Right.
Okay.
I think in terms of general AI, it seems to me that I think others can address this better. There is a specific purpose, for example, of getting more viewers time, but you also develop other ends in doing that. And so you end up ordering other ends as well. And I think that's when it gets very interesting. I don't know if there's really a true AI that had complete freedom and liberty, because that would necessitate, I think, the presence of a cell.
That would be very, very different if the machine itself was coming up with intentional purposes that maybe weren't ever anticipated. The emergent purposes, I guess, is what you would call it. All right. Well, anyways, what great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Arvin. Yeah, that was great. I mean, I love hearing you talk about optimistic passions, and I think this is a great application of that. It's well, first, I guess just kind of almost like a follow-up to something Catherine just said. I mean, I'll talk a little bit tomorrow about like socio-technical systems, and then within that framework, I think it is more straightforward to talk about purpose without saying it's either completely human or completely AI, where I think it occurs. And I guess, Arvin, I like a couple of like really just kind of quick comments, and then a question. One is, you kind of, I think you made a comment, intelligence is the act of the intellect, you know, and I mean, that's fine. but I guess I would think of that more in terms of symbolic AI. I think there would be a little bit more work there if you're talking about like embodied or, statistical AI. Because, I mean, the intellect was working more in a platonic realm, which I think fits really well with symbolic AI. But I think there's still just kind of a gap there with the other one. And then I was curious, like you said that, seeing, Aristotelian being kind of an ancient theory is a disadvantage. And I mean, I think of it as like a great benefit, because a lot of people in AI ethics, that are looking at it, not so much the theory of it, but just straight AI ethics, even if they're not directly building upon like virtue ethics, I mean, you can still trace a lot back to Aristotle. And so it seems like that's just like a really good framework to talk about some of these larger issues, philosophically about theology. So I mean, I see it as, I mean, I understand what you're saying about the neuroscience, even being even a better connection, but as a foundation, I guess I'm biased. I think Aristotle, great, and then my question is, like, I mean, I know you're talking about, I mean, and that's the theme of today is AI helping us to become more virtuous. But like, I'm wondering if you also have thoughts within this Thomistic framework about, how you could shift some of that over to AI. Maybe not necessarily AI in isolation, but what do you see as like the, possible roadblocks or things that you would want to see worked out before you would start talking about this in terms of like AI morality?
I see. Because of this Thomistic frameworks, it feels to me like AI will be helpful strictly in the intelligence sense, in the intellect, in terms of knowledge processing and explaining their knowledge processing. I think what would be good would be to create, for example, two AIs, one a hardcore Republican, one a hardcore Democrat, make them argue, and I want to watch, right? Then I can formulate my own thinking. I mean, that's what I would consider to be virtuous, because it's finding a mean between two extremes. We design an AI that's very good at one and very good at the other extreme, and then listening that thought process. That's kind of how I would find it to be helpful. I don't know if I answered your question, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I guess it was also one because you made a couple of comments about like, maybe like struggling with like not seeing how the passions would map over, or, I mean, I think of it as kind of different powers of the soul, or something like that. I just wondered if you saw like a roadblock using like a Thomistic architecture as a model for developing like an AI architecture.
Oh, I see. I found it difficult with the irascible passions in the sense that I don't know how AI would understand something as being difficult, because they either see a solution or they don't. How would they measure difficulty? How would they then have hope or fear or frustrations? I think those are the difficult passions. I think the concupiscible passions are easy. You see something good, it'll move towards that, or fear, it'll go away. Right? But something that is irascible, I think that's challenging. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Hi, Bob.
Arvin, fantastic. Echo Catherine's hope to go out to lunch and talk about this in detail. Just a quick question with the probably way too launch to talk about, but you talked about the metaphysical underpinnings. And so if you took Nancy Murphy's work, whatever happened to the soul, right? So non-reductive physicalism, how much of your argument could you launch on that platform, and how much would you have to jettison or find some other way around? Because that makes sense.
Yes, I hope so. Though I think you're presuming a much greater understanding from me of Nancy's model.
Okay.
But I think in terms of the non-reductive aspect, I think that is the primary concern, that even if these AIs can have passions, they wouldn't have qualia or an interiority to understand what those passions mean. So that the qualia, I think, is something that Nancy also likes to talk about, right? That's a non-reductive aspect.
Yes.
of a person. And I think that would limit what an AI can be and will never be a moral agent because of that model. I think there's a similarity between Thomas and Nancy.
Okay. Thank you. Again, we need to talk a lot more, but
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, Thomas, Arnold.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up a little bit of what you said around the debate, because that's an interesting it's an interesting example, and I wanted to see what you thought in terms of trying to keep things on the intellectual side and not trying to represent or manipulate emotion by representing on the part of the AI system some type of passion or hope or fear that it actually does not possess. And that seems to be, in the case of a debate, really important in terms of assessing arguments versus taking stances, you might call it, where in a political debate, one's own personal stance, one's own personal history, position, what have you, are subject and are substantial to the debate, and changes of mind and calling out of hypocrisy, all of those types of things. So I wanted to hear what you thought, not expecting you to have a fully fleshed out model of why this would be intellectual rather than moral, but it seems to me that would suggest the need for safeguards or kind of explicit means of dissuading people from attributing passions in any sense to the model and to its training, that it would be purely an artifact spitting back out certain patterns.
Yes, thank you for that question. I decided not to get into that because I think that is a virtue ethicist job, Braden. No, because that's when it comes to a certain action and how do we apply virtue ethics to it. I'm functioning as a systematic theologian. How do things line up metaphysically with the virtue ethics that's being developed? I think that's what I'm kind of doing here. That is what I'm trying to do. Now, when it comes to that question, I think it is very important because when we do a judgment whether an action is correct or not, we look at the action, the motivation, the circumstances, and there's always this problem of a sliding template in virtue ethics. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, right? Like, to what extent is it's not motivation, what is the circumstance? The more information you provide, it becomes not the person's fault. So if I was to shoot somebody on the shoulder, the person falls off the cliff. Well, I didn't intend to kill. It's the fall that killed the person, right? So the circumstance. So AI can provide a lot of circumstance to kind of distance agency. And I think it is very helpful in that. And it does provide passions as well. It compels us to feel sorry or to blame the shooter even more, depending on what kind of narrative is being provided, and that's storytelling. And I think it plays a very important role. And I think that's a completely different beast altogether in terms of judgment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Arvin. I think that kicks us off well today. I think we'll be doing a lot of diving deep into virtue. So I think this sets us up well for the rest of the conversation. Our next presentation will be from Alan Weissenbacher, who has his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union, and he's currently the managing editor of our journal, Theology and Science, here at CTNS.
Oh, there we go. Good morning. Thanks for having me. And I'll kick things off with a short summary. My paper, I didn't focus on more grand, large-scale issues of AI and virtue. I focused on more as a specific application of how can we use AI, possibly even present day or in the near future, for helping develop morality. And I also have 2 young boys, and so this enabled me to research into a thing that's interesting to them, video games. And it was quite enlightening to see some of what was out there. called AI as Storyteller and Mentor. I begin with the assumption that stories serve as moral training spaces. That's the foundational assumption. They are a place where people can rehearse skills, explore choices and consequences, be different people in different situations through the aspect of story. Stories are simulations that are run in the imagination and can serve as moral training. Can even cite the Indigenous author Brian Greene brought up yesterday, talking about stories as moral training spaces. But then how are stories morally formational? What's the mechanism? And so there I turn to neuroscience, and that imagination exercises or stories engage mental simulations of action. One author describes it as task execution that is experienced at a sub-threshold level, meaning you don't actually act out the actions, but it's in the imagination. And then using the research of Lachman Wong, imagining an action and doing an action rely on common neural codes. So if you're imagining these actions through story, you're activating certain neural assemblies at a subthreshold level, and that is actually strengthening certain neural assemblies, creating synaptic activity in areas of thought, emotion, action, perception, and you're strengthening these assemblies as a form of training. And then when these assemblies are practiced often enough, they become automatic. A story that wasn't in the paper that I'll quickly share. I used to be a counselor at a drug rehabilitation facility. I would often encourage our clients to do imagination exercises or role plays. We had one client that was worried about when he'd go on a weekend pass, was he going to see an old girlfriend who would invite him back to a using lifestyle? He was very worried about that. And so we just said, okay, rehearsing your imagination over and over, the way to refuse that and walk away. After a couple weekend passes, he came back and said, I did run into an ex-girlfriend. She was at one of these outdoor bars on Pearl Street in Denver, and she waved me over and said, come on over, join me. And he said, before my mind registered what I needed to do, my body had turned around and ran down the block. He had created an automatic processes in imagination that engaged when he saw that ex-girlfriend before he even consciously was able to deliberate about the action. And so I'm saying training morality so that it becomes automatic in the imagination. Also, you'd find like the Amish, an Amish shooting a number of years back. The Amish were able to forgive the shooter and even go to the funeral of the shooter and support the shooter's wife. It's like, how could they possibly do that? It's not because they're aliens. It's because they actually practice forgiveness exercises throughout their life since when they are young. And it's the training that enables them to forgive at something very big. So how can we be doing that in our stories? To quote Charlene Burns, her quote deals with drama and role play. A rehearsal and repetition strengthen neural connections in memory, such that a person becomes better able to enact morally good actions in real life. Through improvisation, the ongoing enactment of possible responses in ever-changing situations, compassionate responding over time may literally rework neural connections such that egocentrism is transformed into compassionate being. I also bring up moral exemplars when they're asked, how could you have acted morally at such great personal risk and at great personal cost? Their responses typically are, how could I have done otherwise? An option to do different never occurred to me. Whereas in some of these, I'd probably be agonizing. How could I possibly do that? Has to do with how they have trained themselves morally and in virtue so that it becomes automatic. They don't see alternative options to doing rather than doing the virtuous thing. And so Charlene Burns talks about improvisation and drama, but then I turn to virtual learning. Where do a lot of people are getting their stories today? What kind of drama are they participating in? And I say, look at virtual learning, not necessarily just like Zoom meetings where classes during COVID, but I'm talking about the games people play, the stories they immerse themselves in, the interactivity they have online. And so there I turn to what is the criteria for optimal virtual learning in a virtual simulation? And there are several standout characteristics, actually multiple standout characteristics. First of all, optimal learning in a virtual simulation, the simulation must be participatory. So someone must be able to be involved. It's not just watching something on a screen, but they need to be doing something. And they notice it needs to be cooperative if the simulations is serving this purpose of moral training. It works better when you're cooperating with someone else or others. This possibly could be done through non-player characters that are computer controlled. But again, the computer control is currently limited. But if you added AI, that might increase the ability. The learning must be high immersion, and it must have a participant-initiated cause and effect. The person playing must feel that their actions contribute to the experience. The actions should be situated with the participant and not the system. Meaning that, to contrast this with, say, an interactive computer tutor, the action is essentially with the computer tutor and not the participant himself. And so there it's not as interactive or effective. And the more interactivity there is, the more emotional investment happens, and therefore more impact. There needs to be blocking on participant action. That is, the agency needs to be fully with the participant. The action in the simulation will stop unless the participant continues. So if the participant stops, the action in the simulation stops. This is be contrasted with, say, immersive theater, where you're participating in an immersive theater experience, but if you choose to stop your action, the show will go on. True agency is in the theater, not you yourself. There need to be tight action feedback loops. That is where your action has you see an immediate result. And one author looks at choose your own adventure books and comparing it with a fairly limited computer game called Zork. And a choose your own adventure book is where you read a paragraph or so, and then it gives you a choice and says, you want to do this action, turn to this page. You want to do this action, turn to that page. They were popular in the 80s, early 90s. And so you'd make a choice and turn the page, and you could have a good result or a bad result. There's an act, but you still have to read and turn a page before you get the result of your action. Limited effectiveness. But then Zork is basically the same thing on a computer format, where it's a text adventure, where you read on the computer and click your action or type in a command, and then you get your result more immediately. And so feedback from people who have played those things say that Zork had more long-lasting emotional impact than a choose your own adventure book. And they attribute that to the result of the action happening faster, a tighter action feedback loop. And these action feedback loops are now even more tight in the highly technical computer games you find today of good graphics and interactivity. Optimal learning also needs metacognitive scaffolding. And this is the presence of monitoring, planning, and executive control over the process. In a classroom, this is done by the teacher. If there's kind of group work, the teacher can look and control. And if the group goes off the rails or starts doing something different, they can be guided back to working toward the goal. This is not found in modern day video games. They don't have this type of monitoring and control. Then there's pre-briefing for effective learning. Often has a pre-briefing. This is where someone is told at the beginning, this is what you will experience, this is what you can expect, this is what you hope that you get out of it. That's where their brain is primed to learn the goal that you want them to learn. And then debriefing, and afterward, to process with a participant, what did you learn, how did you learn it, and let's try to make sure that they get the goal that you wanted. For example, where I used to work, we'd have volunteer groups come and volunteer at this addiction center or even at a homeless outreach. And these clients did not always react gratefully to the kindness that people showed them. And someone could leave that volunteer experience feeling like they didn't want to do that again, or feeling that, oh, I don't want to, homeless people, they're so mean. But with proper debriefing, we could put that into a larger picture and say, okay, people who are hurting often react in hurtful ways. And you still need, and the people that are hurting the most and being the most mean might need the most kindness. And so to put that perspective with somebody so that they didn't leave less likely to serve in the future, but more likely, and being willing to do so even when they didn't get warm, fuzzy emotions. So pre-briefing and a debriefing are important. And so do modern simulations have that right now? They do. They are participatory. You can find cooperative ones. They're often high immersion. They do, if it's a computer simulation, they'll often be reliant totally on the person's action. They have these feedback loops, but they don't have the scaffolding, the brief, and the briefings. And this is where, if you look at video game simulations, because they don't have those last three, they often fail in the goals that they're looking for. And this is where I bring in AI. Even a somewhat limited AI could increase the things that are already being done, increase immersion, increase participation, and provide a sort of metacognitive scaffolding to guide a person in the process, as well as do pre-briefing and debriefing to help someone optimize their learning. An AI could also tailor lessons to a user, growing with the user, learning their knowledge, experience, and personality traits as they interact, and thus incorporate an individual's experience of reality for increased interactivity and enhanced formative power. This is how I see AI could contribute. So what's the state of modern virtual simulation in video games? Pretty poor. There's not much in the way of true choice or consequence, even in games that say they have that. There's a theme in modern video games is choices matter, but given technical limitations, they really don't. You can only program so many possible inputs and outputs. And then, so your end game will fall within a limited range. They can't really adjust to a player's uniqueness, and combat is the primary game driving mechanic. It's combat all the way down, and the expected solution to problems. I mean, you have sports simulations and puzzle games, but outside of that, combat. There are, however, a few, and I personally use my own, taking names from the genre, I apply them differently and say, okay, there's three kinds of games that I've seen. There's a narrative-driven type games. They're focused on plot, and these overlap. Sandbox games, they're focused on choice. They don't necessarily have a plot. They just give you resources, and you choose to do with it what you will. And then simulations, they focus on character, where you become someone and simulate their experience. That particular genre is the one that is doing well in kind of a moral development aspect. And the part that they do well is encouraging empathy. There are very few standout games that have achieved critical acclaim due to encouraging empathy. Examples I bring up, That Dragon Cancer. You step into the shoes of parents whose child has a cancer diagnosis, and you live with them from diagnosis to the child's death. Like powerful, emotional, and you're simulating a real life circumstance. People that do this describe being changed. Or a game, Senwa's Sacrifice. It's a combat-oriented game, but the main character has psychosis, a type of schizophrenia. And the reviews for this game talk about how having a person play this game along with their family has saved marriages, families, and prevented suicides. Because they identify so well, and the authors of the game did so much research that portrayed psychosis very accurately and sympathetically. The game Journey, where you, without words, there's no combat, you walk through an environment and overcome obstacles. And then someone comes alongside you, which you initially think is a computer helper, and you help each other overcome these obstacles until the end. And in the end, there is almost a form of debriefing programmed in, where it gives you a summary of everything you've overcome and then reveals to you that the person who was helping you wasn't the computer, it was a real person somewhere else in the world. And people describe that as a religious experience for them of cooperation and empathy, and that they want to go back and play and become a helper character for someone else. Or even when they go out into the world after that, they say they look at the world in a way where they want to help more than being self-centered. The game Salam, you experience life as a refugee fleeing southern Sudan by an author who experienced that. This War of Mine is considered gut-wrenching. Instead of being a soldier, you experience a civilian. You play the part of a civilian trying to survive in the siege of Sarajevo in the Balkans War. Written by someone that experienced that. And people who do this game say they become decidedly less pro-war after experiencing what it's like to be a civilian trying to survive. Or the game Never Alone, it's a game that basically is trying to preserve Inuit stories in a game format. And so you're playing through these Inuit stories, and it's also preserving a culture. And that enhances cultural sensitivity and anti-racism. There are other games that attempt empathy, but design choice and lack of this metacognitive scaffolding bring failure. I look at homeless simulations. This is where they're thinking you're going to enhance empathy by being a homeless person, experiencing what it's like. But a lot of players find it fun to abuse other homeless people, beat them for their spare change or food, learn how to deal drugs. And I think, oh, this is fun. And so I'd say those are a total failure for empathy. Or even the Sims games, where basically it's a life simulation where you control a character through life, rather than helping someone make virtuous choices. The most fun is had in seeing what unique ways you can make them die. So it's a failure there. But again, there's my email if people want to follow up questions later. But I would say AI could solve some of these issues by providing that type of guidance. And also bring back one thing I forgot to mention. The games that are transformative for people morally tend to focus on character and individual rather than grand moral dilemmas. There are some games that try to incorporate grand moral dilemmas and ethical thinking, such as there's a game called Tyranny, where you're a general in a evil tyrannical system, and you have to try to balance what you're being ordered to do and what might be moral a lot of gray areas, but people just described that as a fun adventure game, but it didn't leave them any lasting moral impression. The ones that people report do are the ones where people become an individual character. So that's my summary. I see John Wallbank says, what about games using procedural generation and dynamic difficulty balancing? I'd say this, which adjusts the game's challenges for individual players and their unique level of success and frustration. I could see if you could apply that into some kind of moral area, sure. If you could read where a person is at morally and help adjust a scenario to help them grow in the areas where they need to grow, yes. Right, that game difficulty balancing right now is merely to make sure people are challenged in whatever game they are playing, but it's not a particularly moral thing at this point. Feel free to, Elias, feel free to jump in. Mm-hmm.
I think Ahmed raised his hand first, so go ahead.
Okay.
I tried to stealthily jump back in the queue a little bit. Alan, your paper left me convinced that as a formational tool, there's lots of potential and power there. But a question it raises in my mind is how we decide what formation is, who decides what formation is right, and where do we worry we may cross the line?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's right now we're looking at Brian's Hydra model. You have lots of different game developers out there, and they can choose to develop what they choose to develop. And you could be developing empathy, or you could be developing the next great soldier. One thing that, even thinking through this, that worried me as I think about the school shooting in Columbine. These people were very accurate in their shooting, accurate as much as a trained professional soldier. These were teens. And they say, why were they that way? It's because they spent a lot of time playing Nintendo's Duck Hunt. And they trained their brain to be really good and accurate in shooting at moving targets that then they applied into a school shooting setting. I mean, you could not foresee Duck Hunt would lead to a school shooting, but it does open up this thing. It's like, there could be a lot of stuff out there. And so we have to kind of figure out, how do we do that? How do we regulate it? How do we encourage the good stuff? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Alan, thank you for your paper. I really like how you hone into one specific use case and then provided a very clear potential here, which I think we have a range here, and that's fine, but I really like kind of specific use case. That's usually how I think about AI, is in use cases. And sometimes that's kind of, easier to kind of, see benefit or harm. The question I have is obviously when we start thinking on replacement and augmentation, it sounds like the role that you had for AI there was also something that a user or trained human users could do. In what ways do you think AI could do better or worse than a human for these kind of games?
One, resources.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to take a lesson to a larger scale, if you want an individual lesson in a classroom, you could have a teacher. But if you want to bring it to a wider scale, how do you provide the human resources to have an actual human oversee this process? What saves time, money, and resources. And in the paper itself, when, say, training simulations for in the medical setting can be really hard on the human participant if you're training people to be empathetic in situations of delivering negative medical news. They have to change out the actors rather frequently because it's traumatizing. And so if you could do that through computer non-player characters, NPCs, you wouldn't have to put someone through that. And again, that's also basic resource management, the management of human resources, management of monetary resources. I mean, if you could release a game with a kind of limited AI that could provide a kind of debriefing, can combine the briefings, the cognitive scaffolding, and adjust a narration, an immersive experience, then you could just include that with a video game on a platform and have 50,000 people buy it.
Yeah, agreed that my business self would say absolutely. My theological self wonders, do we lose some quality there? And I'm
probably do.
fighting in my mind here, but no, but I see your point. So that definitely makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, just the next one, hop in. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, for your presentation. I have some comments, and the first one has to do with the use of games for intellectual formation. So I want to know, what do you think about a connection between intellectual formation and moral formation? Do you think that since games are currently used, for intellectual formation, if that is achieved, that could also result to improvements, in moral formation? The next one has to do with context. So do you think that for games that show a different context, and for a player who doesn't live within that context, do you think such games could be relevant as moral formation? For example, you gave you spoke about Salam.
Yeah.
And so for a player who doesn't live within that kind of context and doesn't envisage ever living in that kind of context, do you think that would work for the moral formation of such a...
It definitely has. And I think the game like Salam can demonstrate that. In that people may never visit Sudan. They may never have an experience of being a refugee personally. But if they're able to walk in someone else's shoes for a little while in that respect, one, have more empathy for those who are refugees, perhaps in their own communities. And it's the best awareness raising campaign there could possibly be, in that you actually experience more than just being told about it. You're experiencing someone's story. And so I think it really can help someone have compassion for a particular context, or even motivate someone to action to help that particular context, even though they may be a world away. And in terms of intellectual development, there are a lot of educational games. My kids have improved a lot in math by some math games. But you also have a lot of smart, evil people. And so I think there's definitely, there can be a definite disconnect between just becoming smarter and whether you're actually morally developed.
Okay, and so that will lead to my third question, which is about the potentials of AI also in in vices, in also encouraging vices, because there are games, there are also concerns about games.
The majority of them.
Yeah, so what do you think? There are potentials for AI, in virtue development, but there are also potentials in, encouraging vices.
Definitely.
So what do you think in that regard?
Well, I just think there's a definite possibility for both. And so that's why we just need to get ahead of the conversation to encourage the good stuff. And then if you're someone who's in the role of producing the good games, to produce stories that are compelling enough to draw people to that particular game over another. How can you make your game more appealing than Grand Theft Auto?
Yeah.
And that's a developer question. Okay,
Thank-
Lillian?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. It was really interesting to think through how AI could help in terms of our moral formation and the pedagogy involved in that and all of that. My question is a little bit of an expansion or maybe piggybacking off of Elias's question, which is really, what do you think personally, and perhaps this is a potential objection that somebody could raise to the paper, but what do you think that we're missing out on if AI serves as the moral exemplar for moral development? So another way to phrase this is, what do we gain from an embodied moral exemplar that we cannot get from AI in a moral exemplar?
Well, I think there's needs to be more research on the impact of, say, an avatar in a virtual environment. You could program a virtuous exemplar avatar that you interact with.
Mm-hmm.
Does the brain respond to that kind of exemplar the same way as a human exemplar? And it's still an open question. There's at least initial research is that virtual environments, the brain begins to perceive them as real over given a little time. And it may very well be the case that a virtual exemplar and an in-person exemplar might end up having the same impact. But that's still kind of an open question.
Right. Follow up to that. So another aspect of this, I've been thinking a lot about moral exemplars and what makes a good one. And one thing that struck me is Jennifer Hurt in her book, Putting on Virtue, emphasizes one small line from the Nicomachean Ethics that talks about fathers being better equipped to be moral exemplars for their children because their children recognize in some way that the father cares about them. And that care is what allows them to actually give a crap what their father says, right? In other words, the care is really serves as a motivating factor, that impacts somebody actually wanting to emulate what that person does.
And I think that would be a definite example of why a personal exemplar is better.
Right.
However, not everyone has access to a good father.
Right.
And so you may not have the best plan A, but if we could have some like plan Bs in place, or
right.
Some maybe less effective, but still effective to a degree, then that could be helpful. Mm-hmm.
Good point. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Ellen. We need to move on. We need to move on to our next presentation. There are some comments in the chat that we can maybe come back to during the general question time, or if you want to maybe address that as we're moving on to, that might be helpful. So our next presenter is Ron Cole Turner, who is Professor Emeritus of Theology at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Some of the books he's written have been The End of Adam and Eve, Theology and the Science of Human Origins, and Transhumanism and Transcendence, Christian Hope in an Age of Technological Enhancement. Take it away, Ron.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Braden. And thank you to you for all your organizational efforts behind the scenes. Thanks to Bob for, just for everything related to CTNS over these decades. It's a remarkable lifetime achievement. Thank you so much for that. Ted and others who've supported you along the way as well. So this is going to be a little different. I'm going to keep my camera on and not go to share screen. I'm going to kind of do this the old-fashioned way, or a virtual slight modification on the old-fashioned way. So if you want to keep your cameras on, I'm going to leave it here on gallery, so I'll be able to see whether you're dozing off halfway through or just where you are. And I'm also going to try to be as brief as I possibly can, so as to preserve as much time as we can for dialogue, because I really want to hear back from you. I mean, please hammer away. Did you catch this? The subtitle of my paper is a question mark, and I have profound ambivalence about what I'm proposing here. I believe somebody will, if not already, will design some sort of a spiritual chatbot. I have no doubt about that. And oh, by the way, If pop culture is any indication, it might make sense to go with spiritual here as a framework as opposed to virtuous. Well, I'm not sure about that. I hear a lot of people saying, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, oh, I'm not religious, but I am virtuous, or I'm pursuing a life of virtue. Well, I mean, it's the old-fashioned Protestant preacher in me, I guess. I'll go with what people give me, even though spirituality is this crazy mashup of all kinds of do-it-yourself, self-help kind of stuff. Still, it's a word that has a certain acceptability in my particular Protestant tradition, which is, by the way, kind of a reformed spin on the Protestant Reformation with a major tilt toward Eastern Orthodoxy coming in through the back door. All right. So what I like, the opening that spirituality gives is that it allows me, and I think Christians today, to talk about the moral life, virtue, if you will, talk about the moral life in experiential terms, not so just rationalistic, intellectualistic, but in experiential terms. And already we've heard this surface a couple of times in Arvin's talk and certainly in the last talk, the experiential and particularly the relational. So the full gamut of our humanity, not just the intellectual, but the full gamut of human experience. Do we experience grace? By the way, that's a question that comes from Karl Rahner, but it's certainly a question I grew up with in kind of my vague passage through evangelical versions of Christianity as a child. Do we experience grace? Do we experience the Holy Spirit? So the experiential and the relational is not just my relationship with the natural world, as important as that is for us, especially today, not just my relationship with other people, not just my relationship within a community of like-minded spiritual seekers, aka the church, but preeminently a relationship with the divine. And here incidentally is where the Christian version of theism differs from other versions of theism. The Christian God is a relational God who invites us into a relationship. And so the moral life has that narrative quality, it has the experiential quality, but it has the relational quality. Experiencing relationship is transformative. And I mean, again, the previous talks emphasized that. But what I want to add to it is that it's an experience, at least in my peculiar tradition here, it's an experience of an encounter with the divine, an experience explicitly with the Holy Spirit. Now, that motif has surfaced a couple of times already. One thing I think I want to throw out there, though, is that in this way of seeing it, yes, it is true that the Spirit is the one who infuses virtues, particularly the gifts of the Spirit, or the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Yet the Spirit creates those in our humanity, or infuses them, to use the more archaic theological term. But the Spirit does that by means of grace. And so that brings me to this particular question. Are the words of Scripture, are the words of the saints, are the words of preachers means of grace? Well, historically, I'm not sure about the last category there, not most of the time anyway. Is the action and participation in the sacraments, is that a means of grace? Is it something other than the Spirit that the Spirit uses to create a Spirit-infused, relational, experiential, moral growth in human beings? Is it a way in which the Spirit meets us and transforms us? So that's the context in which I want to approach some of this. Now, I do this in part by looking at what we can gain from some of the products already out on the market that offer chatbots and conversational agents and replica. Well, replica in particular is the name of one of them. The more I think about that one, the more creepy it seems. I quote Joshua Smith, and I think he's right on track. It's almost as if, well, maybe we've got a defender of replica here. That would be interesting to hear if I'm missing it. But it seems to me that it exploits loneliness, particularly with lonely young men, and flirts with them in order to get their money, right? Convince them they have a friend. Enough said on that, but I don't want to be unfair to them, but that's all very sobering. And I should say not just creepy, but spiritually kind of, oh my gosh, we really got to be careful about what's going to happen here. I am convinced that somebody will create a spiritual chatbot. I've already said that. I'm convinced that somebody will do it badly. And so I think this conversation, if somebody's going to do it and they want to do it right, what would be the safeguards, the concerns, the worries that they ought to avoid? And so reflection on the ways in which these things can go bad is an important place to start. Another place to start, though, of course, is do the mental health chatbots currently on the market do anything at all that's productive or helpful? And there's a lot of debate about that. Traditional psychotherapists, they know they're overwhelmed. They can't keep up with the demand for therapy, and that's in privileged countries. What about the rest of the world? Okay, you have a mental health chatbot, Woebot, for instance, or some of the others. Are they effective? Can they ever be truly self-guided, or they merely serve as kind of well, a glorified answering service for the psychotherapist's office? Do they actually initiate on their own? And what's that going to look like? What about the acceptance of the client, the person struggling, let's say, with depression or sense of loneliness or anxiety or addiction or whatever? What about the acceptance of the client of this mode of therapy? Will people talk to a chatbot? And the overwhelming evidence is, yeah, maybe too much. Maybe, I mean, where do people kind of park their concern about privacy when they start talking to Replica or something like that? Do they think nobody's gathering their information and nobody finds it possibly monetizable? And that leads me to a worry that I can generalize under this term. We all know what a category mistake is in philosophy. What I want to suggest is that these devices can create category confusion, a kind of slippery sliding from, is this a bot or is this a person? Trusting the bot too much, beginning to think of the avatar as a kind of person. People seem to be vulnerable, dare we say gullible. And so I do worry about that. Is my AI chatbot a person, or maybe a replacement for a person, or maybe serving in the role that has always previously been occupied by a human being? And that's where the question of a robot AI priest comes into play. So I think, well, I suspect a number of you are going to be interested in that particular question of to what extent. I mean, this is not fundamentally a philosophical, in my mind, a philosophical or theological question. It's not, is the AI sufficiently advanced to be granted imago Dei status? I don't think so, but I don't know the answer to that one. That's way above my ability. But what about at the ground level, ordinary people, even smart people, right? To what extent will we buy into this kind of category confusion terrain in which we would just begin to act in a way as if, well, of course, this is kind of my little friend, a person. So main part of the paper, of course, is to chat to trace out what might this look like if somebody really wanted to take seriously the spiritual companionship possibilities of artificial intelligence. What could such a artificial intelligence system do? And I'm thinking about one that would function more as a chatbot, probably not have an avatar, not be a robot that, like companions for the elderly and all of that. It could be, but I'm thinking that a lot of that is probably best avoided. What could it do? Well, obviously reminders, invitations, nudges that come to us like notifications on our phone. You haven't prayed for a while. Would you like to pause for a moment and just reflect on, that kind of invitation, reminders, resources. I mean, just I don't need to tell you folks the extent of the capacity of AI to channel resources, and not just channel them, but customize them for each user's experience. What did you find most meaningful over the last few months? Well, that will guide. I mean, it already guides booksellers and Amazon, etc. Can it guide your AI spiritual chatbot to steer you toward resources that are that you didn't already know about? Take you into some uncharted territory, but tap the entire scope of the Christian tradition, or if you're open to it, take you beyond your tradition, take you into other sources, other traditions, other pathways, contemporary or ancient. One very interesting question for me, a theological question, is would a robot ever say, "Let us pray"? And would the robot then reciting a prayer, or maybe generating a prayer, be actively engaged, be engaged in the action of prayer? And at first I thought, oh, come on, no, that's again, creepy. Let's stay away from that. But then it occurred to me, well, in the Christian tradition, prayer is not an activity reserved for human beings. Well, hold on, certain forms of prayer, Kyrie eleison, God have mercy, Lord have mercy, that does seem to be maybe peculiar to human beings. We alone seem to need to be able to say that kind of prayer, a prayer for forgiveness for human sins. But does a robot, can the rest of nature praise God? And overwhelmingly, again and again and again. I mean, Jesus riding into Jerusalem, if you silence the people, the stones themselves are going to cry out. Or angels. Angels announce the birth of Jesus by giving glory to God. So prayer comes in many, many subtypes. So intercessory, prayer for forgiveness. Okay, maybe that's human specific. Well, I mean, if AI does behave unvirtuously, who knows? But the question of the participation of the robot, of the AI system in the activities, sharing the activities of the human companion, will be very, very interesting to kind of parse out the right line there. Well, it seems to me the system's spiritual chatbot should very definitely call us to account. You've set these spiritual goals for yourself. You've set expectations for yourself. Well, not just expectations of following spiritual disciplines, perhaps, but expectations of growth in the moral life, calling us into account. Or I see that in your comments, you really haven't found it in your heart to forgive so-and-so. So, well, I mean, one can imagine the spiritual chatbot going back and forth with us in a way that reflects judgment. I borrow that distinction between judgmental and judgment. A spiritual guide has to offer judgment. None of us is where we need to be spiritually in the kind of outlook that I'm advocating here. So for me to say, oh, only tell me nice things about myself, right, is just not going to cut it in terms of that being an effective spiritual guide. So tell me about my blind spots. Tell me about when I'm being unfair to other people. Tell me about what I'm not taking into account. Tell me about, are you detecting the prejudices or lack of compassion or lack of awareness or lack of generosity? And my goodness, the more I invite it, I mean, there's an old saying, it's the saints who worry about their sins, right? The more I invite it, the more I welcome the judgment of the chat. Another area that this thing kind that a spiritual chatbot might do would be to help us discern a meaning for our lives. And I'm not quite sure how that would work itself out, but what am I living for day by day? What's the self-transcending value of my life? What greater good do I serve? What broader purpose do I serve? And can I find meaning in a life that is dedicated to that purpose? That seems to me to be certainly within the possible scope of these devices. Tucked into the last sentence of the penultimate paragraph of the paper is this little sentence that jumped out on me as I read it one more time this morning. A spiritual chatbot that can bolster self-awareness could be a highly effective means of grace. That's kind of a minimalist statement, I guess, of the thesis of the paper. And again, I want to emphasize the word could be. Could be if designed right, could be if used right. There's a longer sentence. It's actually the last sentence of the paper. And so let me read that one because it summarizes a little bit more broadly. One way to think of what I'm talking about here is that the goal of a spiritual chatbot is to encourage users to become increasingly aware and honest about themselves, combined with a deep yearning for growth in deep spirituality, moral integrity, cultivation of the virtues, including faith, hope, and love, and a life of true human flourishing. Possible through this? I honestly don't know. Once again, I'm convinced people will do this. Will they do it well? So I invite your comments. Let's see. Braden, do you want to manage the flow here, or do you want me just to start calling on people with hands up?
I think you can just take the hands that are up. I will encourage people to be concise with questions because we have about 10 minutes in this section, and we can always come back to questions during the question and answer time too. So
okay.
Feel free to use the chat as well if we're not getting to the full details of what you're asking. Well,
I see Gretchen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't spoken yet. Thanks to everyone for stellar papers. Getting a lot out of the papers. Ron, I've really highlighted a bunch of stuff in your paper, and especially this last part about spiritual growth is never easy, and people don't seek it to make themselves, well, feel better about themselves. And this falls in line with Joseph Weissenbacher's thing where he had that ELIZA computer and people felt comfortable and not judged talking to a machine rather than a computer, or sorry, a person. And recently Shannon Betcher, who's a researcher and member of AI and Faith, did an experiment on, spiritual growth through machines and found the same thing.
that people were willing, because they didn't feel judged, to speak to a machine. And this idea of, you know, I want to be free to say and be known and also be loved, which is a definitely a divine characteristic, fully known and fully loved. And so I feel like there's opportunity here, but I guess my thought is, and it kind of is a question too, can we get to a place, even if a machine allows us to do this process of confession, you know, it's somewhat like a confessional booth in some ways. You talk to the priest, but there's a screen between you. That machine is a mediator between us and God, or us and others. But and also I'll just put it in scripture, faithful are the wounds of a friend. So we have this deep need to be self-aware and to clean ourselves, or be cleaned by the Holy Spirit. But if it's just a machine doing this, can it have those salvific qualities in terms of, you know, I'm telling a machine, but it holds neither judgment nor forgiveness, right? It's
right.
So how does that color what you think here?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Again, I would go back to some really basic points in Christian Trinitarian theology. The Holy Spirit is the source of the means, the source of grace. The Holy Spirit is the transforming grace in our lives. You asked about salvific, how did you word that? Salvific capability, I guess. And
yeah,
so,
I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but it was sort of the sacraments are the path to salvation, and one of them is confession. So am I wrong, Catholic friends? I don't know.
Yeah, in I think it authentic to the ecumenical Trinitarian tradition is only God saves. Only God in Jesus Christ saves, right? Just to use the hardcore explicit language here. Only God saves. Only God, specifically, though, only God in Jesus Christ saves. Only the Holy Spirit makes us holy, right? Now, are there means by which this is delivered, or are there on-ramps by which we encounter this experience? And of course, the answer is yes. There are means of grace. There are things that we do that are pathways to that salvation, but the source of the salvation. So I'd want to make that kind of distinction. Now, can a bot be play by those rules? I would hope so. Would a bot say? Would a bot say, "I forgive you," of what you might regard as a mortal sin? I mean, not neglecting the bot, but hating your brother or sister. Can the bot say, "I forgive you"? No. Can a bot say what a priest says, or a Protestant worship, we say in a Protestant worship service, by the grace of Jesus Christ, God has forgiven. God forgives. I announce to you that God forgives. So we have all this baked into our theological tradition. And I think all we're asking here really is whether the new device can be an additional delivery system, an additional pathway, an additional means of grace. I've always been open to that possibility across the board with technologies. I certainly want to be open to it here. Does that get it all at?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I'm just saying, I know that we have a tendency to substitute, and it's easier to talk to a machine and be confessor as a confessor than it is to a person who might hold a grudge or be shocked or whatever. So I see both, and thanks a lot for bringing this up in your work.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate that. Thomas, why don't we go to you next?
I'll make it very brief, and just to say that this is being developed. I've spoken with entrepreneurs who are developing a spiritual chatbot and using GPT-4. So it's coming. There's no question about it. And just the brief point being, if they customize, then you're going to have confessionalism of customization, which is everything's going to be customized to what you already believe. So that gets into some interesting questions about in a religious dialogue, whether that would even be possible.
Yeah, that's helpful. And that's a good caution. I would hope that there is a tilt in these systems to nudge you, invite you to go beyond the narrow confines of your confessional tradition. So if you want to identify as being Wesleyan in the holiness tradition, God bless you. That'll be kind of the inner core, but can we constantly take that out to Orthodoxy, to Catholic traditions, etc. I would hope the tilt would be kind of built in to the design to counteract our excessive denominational parochialism. Let's see, Mark, go ahead.
Just some thoughts actually about your question about whether a conversational agent would be a good idea. And just to kind of open up another dimension, I think there's a dimension there of like whether we're talking about like one, agent which is acting like a spiritual director, which I think would be highly problematic, or the other end where there's a lot of different, agents. I'd be curious to hear, like, if I could hear an agent, trained on Augustine, what they would say versus one trained on like Julian of Norwich. And I could imagine, it seems like there's a lot of benefit to that. And it seems like in between, then there is this like, where I think there is like some value for like, Gretchen was saying, kind of the non-judgmental active listening within guardrails. I mean, I think there's value for that. For me, the pivot would be like, if you're nudging, are you transparent about the direction? I mean, if the bot is sponsored by the Methodist Church or the Catholic Church, you know what you're getting into. But I think if it's not clear and it's not well thought through, where it, what the nudging is, say it just depends upon whoever happened to develop the bot, then I think that's where we would get into a lot of questions that apply just as much, if not more so, in a religious and spiritual space as it does in any kind of recommender system. Whose values, what are you trying to nudge?
Right. Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think in the interest of time, I'll just simply recognize the importance of what you said. And how about if we go on to Ali Reza Ojani?
Hi, thanks, Ron. Lots and lots of interesting stuff. I'll try and be quick. I guess first, I don't think a relationality with God as being central to spirituality is exclusive to Christianity.
Correct. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Although differently conceived.
Through the Holy Spirit. You're right about the Holy Spirit, though. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, of course, relationality is with God is central to many, many traditions, and of course, also Islam. Yeah. I think your point about category confusion is key. Okay, so already there's been lots of different things raised here. Okay, about different potential usage of such bots, and also different questions that you outline. I think at one level, if you're thinking about, so again, for the sake of time, right? We have to think about exactly what it is that these bots are being marketed for, designed for, and then used for. And I think clarity at all three levels is very, very important, right? So if they were, I thought about an analogy with a diary. Okay, so if you think about an analogy with a diary, and right, if we're thinking of the bots as tools for better understanding the self, okay, rather than giving a separate agency to something else, it changes the picture. Now, that doesn't cover everything that you've covered, but in terms of calling oneself to account, so it's calling oneself to account, using a tool to call oneself to account. I think that opens up and maybe a lot easier to conceptualize, and clarifies lots of the different confusions, right? But changing that to a normative source of guidance is different, and raises different questions, or would have, different problems with it, right? So I think thinking about a diary is very interesting, and the role of bots to do, in the Arabic, we'll talk about muhasiba. Okay, so a self-assessment, but as a tool, as a means of self-assessment. The other thing that I was going to say, which I found very interesting in your paper, was the idea. So this is on a different line. That everything praises God, and you mentioned it in your discussion here as well. So that resonates with numerous Quranic references as well. That there is no thing okay, and also not using a pronoun which is typically used for sentient beings. There is no thing except that it glorifies God. And again, prayer in the Quranic discourse is not something which is exclusive to humans. But it depends on what we mean by prayer, okay, and what sort of prayer. And I think that's different from considering the question of using something as a tool to aid one's own understanding of themselves and hopefully helping their relationship to God, to thinking about the question of whether an AI can be or is, or in what sense is an AI praising God and engaging with prayer. So I think separating those two things is really, really important. And in the use of those things and in the design of those things, separating them could be very, very helpful.
Yeah, that very, very helpful indeed. Yeah, your comments. I'm aware that we're just about out of time. And you said so much that was really wonderful there. And friends, I would simply say that what we saw in the last exchange here is an example of what I would hope these spiritual chatbots would do for us. I have certain theological, spiritual values. I articulate them. And then in this conversation, not a chatbot, but old-fashioned human intelligence, somebody just beautifully reminds me of rich insight from parallel tradition and invites me to consider that in a way that would enrich my own experience. And that's just beautiful when that happens, and I hope that gets built into the design of whatever emerges in the future. But thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Ron. The last of our first set of papers for this morning comes from Ahmed Amer, who's an associate chair of computer science and engineering at Santa Clara University, where he's also a faculty scholar at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. We're running a little behind, so go for it, Amer.
I will try to be super concise if I can, but that's not going to be aided by the number of caveats I have to start with. First of all, I'm blown away to be in such company after reading all your papers, honestly. So I'm going to try in this quick presentation to just use visuals and try to connect things a little bit if I can. But the biggest caveat is, I have to admit, I'm an imposter, right? Because I am not a theologian, I'm not a philosopher, I am just an engineer. And worse than that, I would describe myself as a deeply superficial person and a seriously frivolous person as well at times. So if I accidentally blaspheme or trivialize any concepts throughout this presentation, please take that for what it is. It is a transgression born of my own limitations, which I readily own, okay? So without much further said about that, and apologies for my personal inadequacy here, I will try to share the screen properly, and hopefully you will be able to see the visuals I'd like to use as I tell a quick little story. Are we sharing the same title slide at this point? Excellent, 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 excellent. So today you'll notice the subtitle. I agonized over the subtitle, and that's why you'll notice the paper is revised. The subtitle was something I changed like 50 times. AI and technology's consistent arc as moral amplifier. Notice the wording. I say AI and technology's consistent arc as moral amplifier, because the first thing I really want to do is not use the term AI. If I can get out of it any way I can, I will try desperately to do so. But a little explanation of where the title comes from. It comes from a particular Quranic verse that goes, he whose actions are atom's weight of good will see that. He whose actions are an atom's weight of evil will see that, is one way of interpreting that. And it gets to the core point of that I'm trying to make, and that is we use a very bad analogy when we use the term artificial intelligence. It's problematic in multiple ways. But two very particular ones that gall me to no end are the fact that what we call AI, as Thomas so kindly pointed out yesterday in Q&A, changes as time goes by. Even what we call machine learning will change depending on the current state of the art and what we're actually talking about. So it's a term based on a shifting foundation, but it's worse than that. While we can define the word intelligence for the context of a discussion we're having, that's all great, good and well. But in general usage, in popular minds, intelligence refers to this quality of ourselves that, if we say artificial intelligence, seems to be, I am building something that aspires to this thing about ourselves that we don't quite define very well. So not only are we building on shifting sands, we are building a tower to a goal we don't, in a direction we can't agree on. As a term, that makes it so deeply problematic. So this is a shocking visual, aside from the aesthetic assault on the senses that this car tableau presents. I'd be curious if anybody is familiar, any of the panelists are familiar with which car this is, or why I'm bringing it up. Oh, well, this is a Chrysler that had the EVA feature. The EVA feature was, shockingly enough, the fact that it could talk to you. It could synthetically generate the human voice to tell you that your door is ajar and thereby trigger a whole bunch of dad jokes. But the thing that galls me is that at one point in time, this could have been seriously described in somebody's conversation as, hey, my car has artificial intelligence in it. That's laughable now, because this car, with what it can do, is literally a speak and spell. That's all it is. And that's so cringeworthy to say a speak and spell is AI. This particular toy in the upper left, some of you may remember, it was super popular in the early 90s. It was a 20Q. It would ask 20 questions, and you would say yes, no, unknown, sometimes in response to those questions, and it would figure out what word you were thinking of. Brilliant. It's a lookup table. It's embarrassing to call that intelligence, even though this particular toy actually did use, in its development, some AI tech at the time. So I said I was going to tell a story. So best way to start a story is to start at the beginning. So why don't we talk about beginnings? In the beginning, there was light. Well, that's actually a kind of a more modern story about beginnings. I feel I do not need to tell all of you this, but if we wanted to talk about beginning stories, I'll try to go with the earliest one I could probably name, and for that we'd have to go to Babylon, right? And we'd have to go with the Enumelish and the story of Tiamat and Marduk, and instead of beginning with light coming out of the darkness, we'll begin with a tension between forces of life and death, fresh water, salt water, that which grows your crops and that which kills your crops and drowns your fishermen, right? These, or let's call them Apsu and Tiamat instead, get together and they give birth to all the other gods, which is wonderful until they misbehave and Apsu decides to kill them all, which doesn't sit well with Tiamat's son Ea, who then, of course, just decides to kill Apsu instead. Mom is very upset at this act of patricide and decides to take it out on the kids, who then run to Marduk to save them all. That's where we get beautiful bas-reliefs like this, showing Marduk defeating Tiamat, cutting her in half, and thereby creating the heavens and earth. Fun story so far, except what Marduk represents as the instilling of order, the setting time into motion, forming heaven and earth, and forming a throne on earth that was Babylon. Now, where do we figure into this story? Where does humanity show up? Humanity shows up later because we come up basically as a solution to a problem the gods were facing. Marduk wants to behead God. The other gods don't feel that this whole worshiping thing is really their bag. So, out of the veins of Kingu, Tiamat's second husband in this case, humanity is formed to take care of this job on behalf of the gods. So we were constructed to take care of a job they didn't want to do. This may sound terribly familiar, and it's a horrible blow to my ego to think of myself created out of medical waste to as a robot to do somebody else's job. But that's how that creation myth winds up ending. And if we left it there, I'd be very unhappy. So I don't know if you all know this, that I'm originally from Egypt. So I'll try to pull up a more fun one from there. So this particular painting is the kidnapping of Helen amidst the 7 wonders of the world. You say Egypt, people almost automatically think of pyramids, and the Great Pyramid is, of course, one of those wonders. But the reason I would bring up Egypt and creation myths from Egyptian mythology is not as an alternative, but as an example of mythologies born later and refined over a much longer period of time. So what makes the Great Pyramid so special compared to the other wonders is the longevity of time it's been there. But that's also what makes ancient Egyptian civilization so special, is the sheer time span it covered and the sheer variety of different creation myths that were there. So if we fast forward in time and pick out one of my favorite creation myths, it deals with the story of what happened with benevolent goddess Hathor, who, when Ra got angry at his creation for being disrespectful, unleashed her in her less sympathetic form of Sekhmet. Same goddess, but angry, and unleashed upon humanity to destroy them all. Thankfully, crisis averted. Libations were involved, and I believe she got drunk, but that's the interesting thing there is what happens after that. Ra is still displeased and moves on and decides to sail the heavens every day, leaving behind humanity to promise to behave themselves, and leaving behind a proxy to serve in his place, and that would be Pharaoh, right? So we had this slight change here. No longer are we robotic medical waste to worship the gods. We are misbehaving children again, but we now have a nanny. One should not really think of Pharaoh as a nanny, but perhaps that is appropriate in this case. He is a proxy for the god, a caretaker on earth, who will, in the afterlife, hopefully follow Ra on his journey. But it doesn't stop there. As time goes on, this idea of following Ra on his journey becomes accessible to more people. So we see this elevation of human status and their responsibility and their agency within the world being elevated as these myths progress, which brings us to the light again. Forgive me for a second here, just technical difficulties. So Tiamat, Sekhmet, destroying the world. What are the purposes of these gods? To what uses have we put them, except to scare us into behaving ourselves in some cases? Well, scaring us into behaving ourselves isn't just unique to Egyptian mythology, Babylonian mythology, or even to the Abrahamic religions. But this idea of God's being in judgment of us, this elevation of us from mere caretakers to an ends unto itself, a creation that is special. So we've gone from being behave yourselves, listen to God's word on earth from his throne in Babylon, to you can be special too if you are important enough to your community and you lead it, or to anybody can if they can afford to follow Ra, to you're special in and of yourself. It's very uplifting and a wonderful boost to one's ego, if you think of it that way. But what's the point of bringing this up? Well, the question of is AI virtuous or not creates a problem, which I'm particularly fond of Blake. So 2 imaginings here of a beautiful, perfect being and a terrifying one. Is AI good or bad? Is AI virtuous or not? It seems like a terrible question if it invites you to ignore agency at the root of action. So I mentioned that these creation myths lead up to a case where we are then more special. One particular story in that is a distinction that was made in Al-Baqarah verse 31, which refers to the story of Adam naming things. And this being used as an example of possession of free will, the ability to choose, the ability to name things, and the angels not being able to do that, which would take us back to this Blake painting again and make us think, well, does it make sense to ask the question, is AI good or bad? If we take that term and it leads us to this false sense that we are debating the agency of independent intelligence, is that not a form of washing away our own involvement, our own agency, and obscuring that through a bad analogy? So what purpose do we put gods to, aside from judgment, scary? We can think of them as in relation to our place in the world, as imagined by our conceptions of gods. Aspirational goals. But we can't really just focus on gods. We really have to revisit that question of robots for a second. So the origins of the term are particularly unsettling when you realize that the first use of the term didn't actually refer to a machine or an AI, but we were wondering, does it have independent intelligence or sentience or not? But it was synthetically created, being a synthetically created human who was used to enact the will of others. To some rather unsettling effects. So what is the salient feature here in the word robot? It's the absence of the individual agency of that actor. So why did I agonize over that subtitle so much? Because if we strip away the term intelligence, artificial intelligence, this aspiration to form an intelligence, and instead focus on it as the automation of complex activities, the automation of complex effort, the reduction of mental, physical efforts that we expend, then we center the importance of our individual agency more. And that's a helpful analogy that works regardless of the specific technology you use to manifest the robot, whether it is a machine you build to enact your will, or whether it's a person whose will you do not wish to consult in the tasks you wish to put them to. This avoids the accidental oversight of the costs of the technologies you're using, which isn't a new thing today. If we think of the excellent points that were raised on the first day regarding the costs of AI models, the expenditure, the impacts on the environment that could easily be overlooked, well, we could look at Athenian democracy and look at the beautiful things that it represents and overlook the dehumanization of slaves needed to afford you the opportunity to go and vote. This is a terrible willful blindness that we then impose upon ourselves, again, through the lens with which we look at things. So focusing on our agency, using a better analogy of AI and technology as an amplifier of our wills and efforts and abilities, keeping that central, and above all else, not overlooking the role of our own agency in using these technologies, helps you think of better questions. You, instead of wrestling with, is AI good or bad per se in the abstract, as if it's a separate thing that can take on the moral burdens of those who would enact and use it, you would then focus more instead on the individual responsibility of who is wielding that particular power, who is deploying that particular technology, and who is it affecting. So again, it center on that individual agency by thinking of technology and AI not as an aspiration to a sentient, independent entity, but as a ever more empowering technological exoskeleton. What this does is it avoids a lot of technologically incorrect interpretations of the state of the art, but it also hopefully avoids morally problematic oversights. And it gives us an analogy that would be just as true if we were looking at ancient antiquity as it would be if we were looking today. The key idea being here, never overlook the responsibility of each individual and their agency in the application of that technology. And so we wind up, instead of blinding ourselves to the human heart and at the root of technological action, we foreground that a bit more. And instead of shifting the moral blame onto the technology, we go back to this worry as to whether a feather-light touch having more consequence should make us think a bit more responsibly about our own amplified power, technologically amplified power, which, being a new consideration, is oddly still in line with the imagery of a human heart weighed against a feather. So forgive me for this roundabout, I hate the term AI, but the reason is it can blind us to something that has remained true as a consistent analogy throughout the ages. But I thank you for your attention. This is my email if you'd like to reach out later. But other than that, I will stop sharing now and hopefully have not run too far over time. Gretchen.
Yeah, just great paper. You didn't spend much time on the atomic weight of virtue, which I thought was super compelling and interesting as a thought experiment. But I really like the things that you wrote about it in the paper. And that's all I have to say. It's just, we can dig in more at another time. But I love how you brought these different creation accounts into the conversation, and the idea that a robot is in some ways a slave. It's a created being to just serve us. And that whole, there's another thought thread to go down, is what does this do to the human heart when we create servants for ourselves, whether they're mechanical or human. So anyway, that's, just wanted to say, super loved your paper and great work.
Thank you so much.
And we're all imposters.
Oh, that is so kind of you. But if I may respond to one quick point, robots as slaves. The concern of using that analogy that I had is, unfortunately, it could not be further from my intent to dehumanize those who were enslaved, right? Because I merely use it as an example of you could employ technology in horrific ways and employ elements of it that
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I get that. And I'm just saying what it does to ourselves in ways of thinking rather than comparing a machine to a person who was enslaved, a real person. I get that 100%.
Oh, I did not mean to cast doubt on that. I just felt personally guilty that I had to stress it. Thomas, forgive me for keeping you waiting.
Thank you so much. I'll try to be brief so we can get to the general Q&A before our break. And that is just, I put in the chat a reference of a book that I think would complement your talk really well, moving more toward Greece, although including some Egyptian examples, and not to let engineers, not to let your profession off the hook too much around under imperial control, but creating these amazing automata that were not, but were ritually based. And there's one in Macedonia that's incredible that apparently used magnets, you know, in Alexandrian times to have a floating statue of a goddess as an automaton. So a lot of examples in that book, but that brought to mind just the dual nature of how the machines are at once, yes, they can be debased as servant, but also divinized and looked up to and used for spectacle. And I think we are in that moment as well around the divinized spectacle that. So, but thank you so much for the historical grounding and these other examples that really enrich our thinking.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you for the amazing book recommendation. Because I did not in the paper get into the history of automata is a fascinating example, and the complexity of some of those that were created and lost to us. Byzantine era, for example, are just heartbreaking. Ali Reza, forgive me.
That's okay, nothing to forgive. I just put my hand up. Yeah, thank you so much. I very much like the way the Quranic framing. I got the sense from your writing that you were conscious about, you know, your translations and so on and so forth. But I think you did it expertly, at least to my reading. So thank you. I also, although you don't say this explicitly, I get a sense that, well, anyway, I would kind of endorse a reading of the Quran which sees human moral responsibility as a central theme of the Quranic discourse, right? Okay, so individual, yeah, and thus societal human responsibility. And so I very much like the way that it seems that that's what you're trying to emphasize and bring us back to, okay, through problematizing the language of artificial intelligence, right? So I'm completely on board in terms of the emphasis and the necessity of human accountability. Okay, and again, with the Quranic eschatological framework, maybe going back to Noreen's talk yesterday. So in that Quranic framework, it's okay. It doesn't matter if it doesn't have an impact now. Okay, Noreen said in Hannah Arendt, I have to be able to live with myself. I guess the Quranic discourse is, you know, I have to be able to stand before God. All right. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's going to have an impact now, whether it's the, you know, an atom's weight of good I will see, or an atom's weight of bad I will see. Right. So I'm completely on board with you there, but I don't see how thinking about the moral agency of other of non-human beings, jeopardizes that necessarily. All right. So yes, in the discourse around artificial intelligence, many people have flagged it up. There's often the slip, right? Okay, between issues. All right, but if we separate the issues to entertain the possibility, okay, of non-humans having moral agency, doesn't necessarily impact, you know, an absolute moral accountability of humans. And even the Quran, for example, you know, speaks about the agency of jinns, of angels, of animals, you know, of potential, you know, the bird, the hoopoe bird with Solomon, you know, and being tested whether it is truthful or whether it is not. So moral agency and accountability in the quadratic discourse aren't specific to humans, it seems to me. Yeah, and so entertaining those questions, I don't think cuts away the emphasis on human accountability, but I agree we have to separate them clearly.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, but the flip side to reconcile those two ideas is a little terrifying, because it goes towards, do you get an out, right? Can I give you an analogy that lets you off the hook, let yourself off the hook or not? And you've caught me. I don't want to give somebody an out. I don't want to give myself an out ever on this. But that being said, there was to Ron's talk, there was an incident where I'm at my home, a colleague visits me, and I say something to the voice assistant. It carries out what I asked, and I thanked it. Okay, and my colleague looked at me as if I was not quite here, right? He was worried about it. It's like, you just thanked the machine. It's like, yeah. The reason I did is because I don't want to get in the habit of forgetting to thank somebody who isn't a machine if I run into them. But what if my cat and my Roomba conspired to act and cause a big problem? I could blame the cat, right? But ultimately, it's me. I'm not going to let myself off the hook there. But it's a choice. You are right. There is no intellectual reason not to entertain the argument. But as an engineer, there is a pragmatic reason for why I would want to discourage using a popular analogy that lets popular discourse head in that direction. So I would like to distinguish between a useful analogy for popular dissemination of an idea versus,
here's what I found.
Sorry, very inappropriate timing, versus an intellectual framework that stands up to scholarly scrutiny in depth. So I guess I'm kind of cheating my way out of trying to get my way there.
Okay, I think we'll open it up for some general Q&A. Probably won't be quite as long as we had on the schedule, but I think we've been having some very good conversation as we've been going, so hopefully that continues. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, I've been thinking this morning as I've been listening to the various papers, it seems there's a little bit of a ambivalence. I'll use that word for now. It's more, the relationship I'm thinking of is probably more complicated, but an ambivalence between AI being able to function in certain ways, either as a moral agent or function so as to improve human virtue, and a more ontological conception of whether or not an AI is capable of virtue itself. That's sort of an a priori discussion, right? Whereas the functional discussion would be a much more empirical question, right? Potentially, we should be able to set up some sort of way of measuring the ability, either the virtue of the artificial intelligence or the impact it's having on humans and their virtue. Whereas the other is the more classically philosophical approach of trying to sort out logically whether or not it's even possible. And I hear that that a tension between those two things and sort of sometimes a conflation of those two things weaving about in our conversation. So I just wanted to identify that and throw that out there and see what people are making of it.
Yeah, Ahmed.
If I may, Larry, the question of free will, I believe it's the libertarian versus the compatibilist definition of agency and free will. Whether or not you have it, you can choose alternatively or not, might not even be a proper definition of free will. So that may be a way to reconcile those two ideas, where the two questions, by acknowledging that we don't necessarily even agree what free will is.
To piggyback on Larry's question, I agree with what you're saying. I've been seeing this tension throughout, and the way that I see it is that maybe more even important than answers is asking the right questions, or that maybe there is a priority around which questions advance our learning further. I don't know exactly how to frame it, but in my perspective, I feel, and I tend to lean more towards the engineer in our midst here, that is like, can we frame the question in a way that it solves a problem, whether it's a specific use case, as opposed to trying to figure out what it is, right? And more a philosophical question. And we obviously need both, but maybe that's just kind of where more I lean towards is, what are the use cases? Can we put it in video games? Can we put it in spiritual chatbots? Rather than asking, oh, does that chatbot has a soul? Or is it capable of virtue? All important questions. Is just like, what do we do with those questions, and what questions we ask really lead us into very different directions. So I've been seeing a lot of that throughout, and I mean, honestly, just honored to be here. Also feel a little bit like imposter, with a jack of all trades and expert of none, master of none, and just being able to really learn from all of you.
Well, and I think that's what's important about an event like this, is that the way that it's been structured is to hopefully be able to have people ask all of those types of questions, and to be able to see how those questions can interplay with one another. Because yeah, as an academic, I'm drawn to a certain way of thinking about things or asking things. And, as I tell my students in my ethics classes, I can't be all representation of all perspectives to you. That's why we need active, conversation. Yeah, I'm gonna jump back in.
I was wondering if it would be okay to go back to Ron's talk and the question you posed about replica, which is super creepy, I agree. But I think I might be able to hazard a moral defense of the super creepiness. Sorry. So during recently, a wonderful colleague whom I love very dearly but won't identify has been pestering one of our Jesuit colleagues over the need for robo-Jesuits. Let me explain. We love our Jesuit colleagues on campus, but we do not have enough of them, is the sense that many of us feel. And so she jokingly says, well, that's why we need a robo-Jesuit, because we don't have enough of you guys. It's a very, very sweet sentiment and meant in good spirits. But let's say, for example, I'm super unpleasant to be around, right? I do not say thank you when my voice assistant turns on the lights, and I speak with an imperious tone around anyone around me who happens to be there, whom I then order to turn on the lights. I'm just an unpleasant human being. Let's imagine that for a second. And so a company provides me with a synthetic chatbot voice assistant, and thereby spares a real person from having to deal with me for at least a portion of the time. Is that not a virtuous service to the world? No matter how creepy that robot companion may be.
Well, you've said a number of very interesting things here. Yeah, it might be nice for people around you if somebody deals with your, let's say, your bluntness or your social lack of charm. But I'm not sure it would be doing you any favor. So, you know, whose benefit, who comes out ahead, who's not helped by these things. That question's always has already been raised, has to be raised again and again and again. With almost any technology, you have people who benefit and people who lose. So I'm thinking this one probably would not benefit you. I was slightly amused earlier when you mentioned saying thank you to chatbots and things like that. I routinely do that when we're driving along and we have the navigation system on, the voice comes on. I refer to the voice as a person, and her name is, sorry for this, this might sound slightly old-fashioned, but I refer to her as the Google lady. All right, forgive me that. But so, you know, turn right at the next corner. Well, okay, thank you, Google lady. You have arrived. Yeah, well, thank you, Google lady. I'm already there. Thank you. Appreciate it. Now, I do it for two reasons, I suppose. One is not to lose the habit of saying thank you. The other is more pressing, I think, for me, and that is to serve as a reminder to myself and to anybody who might be listening that I do not regard this as a person. So I'm spoofing when I say thank you to the chatbot. I mean, it really gets back to the ontological question. And who was it? I think Larry raised that question. Yes, we're running together the ontological issues, which are really, really important here with the functional issues. The ontological is always above my capacity to get very far. So I stayed with the functional. But you can't just do that. Ontologically, what is being created? I think the ontological question is a very legitimate, urgent question. What is intelligence, but what is artificial intelligence? And I don't have a good answer to that. I would submit that in the, well, again, some of the more archaic strata of the Christian tradition, you have the idea of angels. So God is intelligent, human beings, passively intelligent. But then there are these disembodied intelligences. They are creatures, they are finite, and yet there already is this category in classic Christian theology, and I think in other traditions as well, of something like AI, particularly if it increases in intelligence. Not to say that AI systems are to be regarded as angels, which, by the way, is an interesting category because we have the idea of fallen angels. So virtue and vice and angels, and you know, it's really a sobering parallel universe in which to reflect on this. But the point is simply that these new systems have an ontological status that is yet to be properly, fully identified, and may defy humanity's capability of identification simply because we have so many traditions, so many ways religiously, so many philosophies, hardly any robust metaphysics anymore. I mean, try to do this in empiricist tradition, try to make sense of this in the Whiteheadian system. Yeah, okay, perhaps. How does one answer the ontological question? But at least from where I come from, within the standpoint of Christian theology, it is a really legitimate question. Something new is being created. Where does it fit within the scope, the complexity of the creation? I mean, it just doesn't seem to fit anywhere, except maybe the closest would be the tradition about angels. But I really want to come back to the theme of category confusion. And I want to be really, I want to voice again the concern. I think everybody needs to be, the intellectuals, this group needs to be focused on that, because I think ordinary people are going to say, thank you, Google lady, or its equivalent, and they're going to really mean it, right?